Hello again. This session, how ESG can benefit from Indigenous leadership and values. Please welcome Scott Munro, Deputy CEO of the First Nations Financial Management Board, Jacob Beaton, owner of Tea Creek, and Jason Forsyth, CEO, Inlailawatash Limited Partnership. Gentlemen, please begin.
Well, thank you, Yvonne. Hello, bonjour. My name is Scott Munro, and I'm a member of the Kaska Nation from the Yukon Territory. I would like to take this opportunity to first acknowledge that I'm meeting with you today on the unceded shared traditional territories of the Musqueam Nation, the Squamish Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. The Coast Salish peoples have lived in this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Their stewardship and care for this land, since time immemorial, is of immense benefit to all people who call this land home. My co-presenters today will show what some of these benefits look like. Since we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to also acknowledge the importance of the lands that each of you are on. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the effects of residential schools and colonialism on Indigenous families and communities, and to consider how we must, in our own way, move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Let me begin today's session with some context. While ESG and sustainability are fairly new concepts to many businesses and organizations, they actually embody long-held Indigenous values and ways of life that have existed since time immemorial. 7-generational thinking is an Indigenous way of describing sustainability. The connections between the natural environment, biodiversity, and the way we govern our impact on this planet are well understood by Indigenous people. This presents an opportunity for Eurocentric economic systems to catch up and even learn from Indigenous people. As you know, ESG standards are being developed at a brisk pace across accounting, securities, and corporate sectors. It's critical for Indigenous people to be involved in setting these new standards. Including Indigenous factors at the center of ESG will bring many benefits. For one, the cost of capital for worthy projects that are greener and more sustainable will be reduced. This can both attract investment to Canada, advance reconciliation, and breathe life into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. To illustrate the potential, this session will provide some case studies of how Indigenous people are leading in sustainable developments and highlight areas where further change is needed. We should be able to wrap up in time for some questions and answers. So let me begin with some context about who Indigenous people are. There are more than 476 million of us around the world in more than 90 countries, speaking more than 4,000 different languages. Indigenous peoples represent about 6% of the world's population, yet they are stewards and protectors of 80% of the planet's biodiversity. Quite a remarkable stat. Indigenous people represent about 5% of Canada's population, and it's the fastest growing demographic in our country. I believe that ESG will benefit from Indigenous leadership and inclusion. Environmental stewardship and biodiversity enhancement are central to Indigenous core beliefs. As I mentioned, 7-generational thinking is an Indigenous way of making sustainable decisions. It requires consideration of the impact that a decision will have on future generations. Indigenous inclusion reduces risk and leads to better financial outcomes. I'll show you some examples shortly. Indigenous people have thrived for thousands of years by ensuring a sustainable environment. In short, we only take what is needed and respect the limits of what nature can provide. It has been proven that companies with diversity in senior management and boards outperform their peers and competitors. I believe Indigenous inclusion helps reduce risk and allows companies to act on opportunities much faster. Policymakers will be better equipped to implement UNDRIP. And thirdly, Indigenous inclusion will accelerate the transition to a low carbon or net zero economy and reduce the cost of this occurring. After all, new major energy or mining projects will require upfront consultation with Indigenous rights holders and ultimately their free, prior, and informed consent. When it comes to Indigenous inclusion on corporate boards, the stats are, well, bad. There's not really any other way to put it. While the data does show that some improvement has been happening, Indigenous people are drastically underrepresented on corporate boards in Canada. The good news is that the Canadian Securities Administrators have proposed some changes to disclosure rules. The proposal would require companies to disclose Indigenous representation on boards. This approach, I would encourage everyone listening to this session to submit a comment letter to your provincial securities regulator supporting this new mandatory disclosure of Indigenous inclusion on corporate boards. And I can share details on the proposal if you contact me after today's session. Of the companies willing to disclose, unfortunately, only 9 reported having an Indigenous person on their executive team. I will point out that since regulators made it mandatory for companies to disclose how many women were on boards, the stats began to improve very dramatically. So I think we should do the same for Indigenous. You may wonder why I'm highlighting stats that show how underrepresented Indigenous people on boards and in executive management in the private sector. Well, I will now show you some examples of how this lack of diversity has negatively impacted shareholder value. There are also examples of how enterprise value have been added or created as a result of inclusion. Back in May of 2020, it was reported that ancient historical rock shelters in Juukan Gorge in Western Australia were deliberately blown up by mining giant Rio Tinto to expand their mining operations. These rock shelters showed evidence of continuous human inhabitation dating back more than 46,000 years. The rock shelters were very culturally significant to the area's Aboriginal people, the Putu Kunti Karama and Pinakura peoples. Initially, the board of Rio Tinto decided to simply reduce executive bonuses as a gesture of atonement. This was not received well. In response to an outcry from Indigenous people and investors, Rio Tinto's board conducted a review of their initial decision, which led to the departure of the CEO, the iron ore boss, and the corporate affairs boss. A significant amount of money had to be spent by Rio Tinto to act on recommendations that eventually came from a more fulsome public review of this disaster. This had material negative impact on the company and its shareholders. This could have been avoided if the company had Indigenous people in the executive team and the board of directors. Back in 2019, the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc Nation sued the BC Chief Inspector of Mines over their decision to issue an amended permit under the BC Mines Act. And this amendment allowed the owner to increase production at the quarry that they operated. The nation claimed that BC failed to adequately consult the Tk'emlúps Nation and their citizens, and the decision to issue the amended permit, among other claims. In October 2021, the BC Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Tk'emlúps Nation. Now for a positive story. This slide provides an example of a First Nation in the northwest part of British Columbia who are successfully building an economy for their citizens with companies who understand the terms of doing business. It was announced earlier this year by Skeena Resources, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, that their proposed SK Creek gold-silver project located in Tahltan territory will be the first mining project to have permits issued under UNDRIP. In fact, just last week, Skeena announced that it successfully raised $73.5 million of financing to carry out early development activities at this project. I believe that the capital markets are starting to reward companies who explicitly include Indigenous factors into their ESG strategy and punish those that are not in the form of higher costs of capital. So my question is, which category do you want your business to be in? So I'd like to now pass things over to my co-presenter, Jason Forsyth, who will provide us with our first case study of how First Nations are quietly playing a central leadership role in protecting and enhancing our biodiversity. So Jason, I hand the presentation over to you so you can share with the audience the ESG leadership role that the Tsleil-Waututh Nation is showing.
Thank you, Scott. So as introduced, my name is Jason Forsyth. I am the CEO of Inlailawatash Limited Partnership, which is a wholly owned company by the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I'm also coming from the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh here in downtown Vancouver. And this is a good segue presentation from what Scott just highlighted, because from those examples of what not to do, and another nation that's doing some really good work, we have an example from Tsleil-Waututh that we think provides a really good foundation for ESG criteria or standards, and really helps literally map out how you avoid the pitfalls of destroying sacred sites in Indigenous territories, or just being on the wrong side of a stewardship vision. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation produced the Inlailawatash Indian River Watershed Integrated Stewardship Plan last spring. It is available on the nation's website, which I can give out later, and it was also featured in a fantastic piece by Justine Hunter in the Globe and Mail. And this is a very special area to Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on that, and then link back to the ESG conversation. So for those of you that have never had the pleasure of being in coastal British Columbia, this is a very typical looking valley. This is a shot of looking at the Indian River and the Indian River watershed. Many of these valleys are very steep. They have snow-capped mountains and then beautiful cascading forests down to lush valley bottoms and crystal clear rivers that are full of salmon and biodiversity, then empty out into the ocean via these big estuaries that you can see. And what's really remarkable about the Indian River watershed is its proximity to downtown Vancouver. Now this, I don't know how big this is showing up on the screen that you're looking at, but just to the bottom here is downtown Vancouver, and you have North Vancouver. There is a coastal inlet called Indian Arm, which is about 20 kilometers before you reach the Indian River watershed, which is about a 20,000 hectare watershed. And again, about a half an hour boat ride, depending on how fast your boat is, from downtown Vancouver. So it's a real gem for Tsleil-Waututh as part of their territory to have an urban interface, but also have this incredible rural setting. And just a bit of a background on that, like Tsleil-Waututh, I don't think they have rock shelters that date back 46,000 years, but certainly over 10. And this image that you see before you is actually a painting that hangs in the Mayor of Vancouver's office, and it's called 1792. It's definitely a colonial construct, because it's the ships before you is the British and Spanish exploration meeting up in what's known now as English Bay. And obviously what's missing in this painting is the host of Indigenous people that live throughout this region, including Tsleil-Waututh. And really from Tsleil-Waututh's perspective, they've been in what's now called Burrard Inlet, which they call Tsleil-Waututh Inlet, which the translation of Tsleil-Waututh is people of the inlet, and they've been there from time out of mind, and actually have records, and the Spanish have in their record logbooks of meeting Tsleil-Waututh people at Inlailawatash, which is the mouth of the Indian River, in 1792. Unfortunately, the arrival of British colonization, British-led colonization in this region did not go well for Tsleil-Waututh territory. Tsleil-Waututh were heavily impacted by smallpox and other diseases brought in. Their population drastically reduced, and their territory was literally stripped of resources, fish, wildlife, And as these kind of images are showing on the slide right now, is the forest, the old growth cedar, was completely liquidated from the Indian River watershed. The picture of the gentleman poring over the map, one of them is Elder Iggy George, and his saying was that the valley got logged from stem to stern, and it did. It was all taken at once. We're talking, clear cuts in the tens of thousands of hectares, impacting salmon, impacting wildlife, and impacting tsleil-waututh culture. In the late 1990s, though, tsleil-waututh kind of said, all right, enough of this. We need to get control of our territory. And we're going to start that by having a bold land use vision where tsleil-waututh looked to do a comprehensive land use plan for this part of their territory, and then eventually take over any of the appropriate economic development opportunities that the land use plan would yield. And so just a couple steps to that. Again, this is another map that may be difficult to see, but I'll orientate you. The bottom corner here is the Indian River watershed. The tiny words there call it the Indian River planning area. And this is where tsleil-waututh utilized an opportunity that came from the provincial government. In British Columbia, at least, there was a large land use planning initiative that took place in the late 90s, early 2000s, called the Land and Resource Management Planning, and it was Crown led by the BC government. In this case, this land and resource management area was the Sea to Sky corridor, so very famous. It's the Squamish Whistler up to Pemberton corridor, world-class ski and mountain biking resort, lots of tourism and recreation. But tsleil-waututh used this opportunity and said, you know what, you can do your planning work and you can send us a copy when you're done, but focus, we'd recommend you focus working with Squamish Nation and Little Nations to the north. But tsleil-waututh would like to do their own Indigenous-led planning process for the Indian River watershed. And fortunately, and to the province's credit, they agreed. This is probably one of the first times they gave the authority of a planning process over to a First Nation. And so I'm going to give you a quick flyby of what tsleil-waututh did when they had the pen, because they did do a very different approach. Often land use planning kind of already thinks about the industries that are operating on the land base and kind of plans around them. And tsleil-waututh really just cleaned the slate and did what we would call a value articulation or a value-based plan, where they focused on what was the most important aspects of the land base to tsleil-waututh Nation, and then looked at what the economic opportunities could be. So of course, at the foundation of this is tsleil-waututh cultural values. And the picture, you can see the elders there are working on, that's taken in 1997. And that was when tsleil-waututh did what's called a traditional land use and occupancy study, where elders and community members put forward all their stories, all their history that they've known and oral history onto maps. And that way, sacred sites, things like in Australia, like those rock shelters would have been picked up, I'm sure. Sacred sites, village sites, harvesting areas, you name it, all gets captured. That really captures the historic use. The bottom picture kind of symbolizes what we call contemporary use. Is this, tsleil-waututh culture is not static. Their use of their territory is not limited to the past. In fact, it's being used right now, today, and it will be into the future and for future generations. And that's what this work is looking to. It also recognizes that tsleil-waututh values are completely intertwined with everything else going on, but certain species have special cultural value, things like salmon, and this kind of dark, can't really see them, but this dark picture of the river there is actually, that's a river full of salmon. And old growth cedar, western red cedar, the tree of life, is also incredibly important. So those areas get mapped out, and those values are articulated throughout the plan. The second suite of values is more from what we call watershed integrity. So these are, what we call riparian forests that are, the really unique and biologically rich forests that are next to small creeks and rivers. It's carefully mapping out unstable terrain, where a lot of logging roads and previous activity had damaged the terrain, and we had a lot of landslides. So protecting and managing that, really to ensure that the river, which is at the heart of everything, stays clean and flows clear, for the whole system to work. And lastly, the other suite of values that's mapped out throughout the plan are biodiversity values. So everything from remaining old growth forests to the megafaunal wildlife like elk and grizzly bear and mountain goat, but the smaller critters like tail frogs and owls and marbled murrelets. And then also the plants. The plants are so important. There's a rare and endangered plant communities, ecosystems at risk. All of this gets mapped out. All of it gets layered throughout the plan. And again, another map that certainly don't worry about reading the legend here, but what this map is articulating is when you layer in all those values I just spoke about, and you map out where they are and their level of importance. Tsleil-Waututh ended up with three main categories for this plan. One is a watershed reserve. So this is where no activity would take place. It's 100% protected. These are the most sacred sites, the red listed plant communities, the old growth cedar, those types of things. And that actually works out to about 55% of the watershed area got fully protected. The next is a management zone. So that's kind of the beige, where again, there's lots of values there, but there is room for appropriate economic development. But any development would need to be basically considering a 50% protection. So no large scale development, it would need to fit kind of a modified with 50% of any area being protected throughout it. And then the last is a stewardship zone, which again isn't a no protection. It's more like a 25% protection, and that represents about only 17% of the area. So this is really the blueprint then for economic development opportunities. So once you know this, and this approach, Indigenous led, you protect all the values, then you think about, okay, well, what could fit in? What would be appropriate economic development? Not surprisingly, the industries that Tsleil-Waututh is choosing to practice and partner in are very natural resource based to kind of fit this. At the forefront are Tsleil-Waututh businesses doing ecotourism, wildlife viewing, and other kind of tourism and recreational activities. Tsleil-Waututh has their own company leading this, Takaya Tours. They have their own forestry company, which is managed by Inlailawatash, which is also practicing ecosystem-based forestry. We have fisheries management. The plan also recognizes that there's some existing very important infrastructure for the Metro Vancouver area and British Columbia. There's high voltage transmission lines that come through the watershed. There's a natural gas line. So it's also recognizing that those pieces of infrastructure need to fit into this plan as well. And there's also room for growth of other innovative industries like clean energy or micro hydro or run of river that haven't been developed yet, but could be contemplated. And then lastly, just the plan ends with an implementation section, which is really recognizing like Tsleil-Waututh has a very forward thinking that they recognize they can't do everything alone. So they want to lead, but they want to partner. So they're open to partnerships both with crown governments like the province and Canada and their agencies, but also other jurisdictions, third parties, whoever it may be. The analogy that many Tsleil-Waututh elders use is many people are invited in the canoe, but they're the skipper. And so I'm just going to wrap up here with a little bit of a thought of this Indigenous-led land use planning. How can this kind of fit into this conversation of ESG, and particularly the examples that Scott talked about? How do we avoid that? Because I think there's a chance to flip the script here and really de-risk projects, so they're not going to get either held up or have major opposition from Indigenous groups that projects or companies are trying to operate in. And so just again, like the current approach that happens at least in British Columbia and perhaps across Canada is you generally have a crown government land use planning process. They're out doing the planning, kind of setting things and trying to get feedback from Indigenous nations. Usually developments are proponent driven, so they're coming from outside, sometimes from other countries, to try to get a project going, spending lots of money on planning development. You then have a crown government permit and approval process for this. And usually at the very end, those permits and approvals will then go for a consultation with First Nations. and perhaps an accommodation agreement where if there's impacts, you may have an impact benefit agreement or other type of benefit agreement. And really a lot's riding on that, because if a nation isn't in favor of it, if it turns out that your project or the industry is actually going to put at risk some of those sacred sites or some of those values that are really important to the nation, you're only finding out after, tens of millions of dollars and a lot of sweat equity has gone into some of these projects. And unfortunately, in some cases, they get forced through. And you have a result of court cases or really unhappy people on all sides. So I would offer that the Indigenous-led approach is a far superior from the get-go. So in Tsleil-Waututh's example here is it's a First Nation government-led land use plan, not a Crown. And then when you get to a proponent development, then it also allows the opportunity for the First Nation to either be the proponent. In the case of Tsleil-Waututh, they are the forest company, they are the tourism company, they may be the clean energy company, or at the very least, they're a partner in that development. And increasingly, and Scott mentioned the Tahltan example, they're one of the few Section 7 nations to have a Section 7 agreement with the province of British Columbia under the new UNDRIP legislation, where they're able to give Crown approvals and permits. So increasingly, we're going to see that First Nations and the Crown government will be giving out permits and approvals. And lastly, we can kind of get away from this, what we call the consultation accommodation game, and do away with it. Because if the nations are fully on board and in fact are the proponent or a partner, then really we're just talking about project revenue sharing. We're talking about equity, and we're talking about tax revenue sharing with the Crown governments, as opposed to this kind of negotiating or trying to accommodate the nations with small sums of money. So overall, this just totally flips the script on de-risking a project, because by the time a project comes up for approval, it's already well underway. So I wanted to just highlight that. I'll kind of wrap up and thank you, and I'll obviously save any questions for the panel. But thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to Scott and over to Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jason. I'd like to now pass it over to Jacob Beaton. And Jacob, I'm really looking forward to hearing your great work that you're doing at Tea Creek. So please, Jacob.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jason, for your presentation. Thank you for having me. My name is Jacob Beaton. My name's also Jaffa-Skatwan-Skeek. I am Lach-Skeek Eagle Clan from the northwest coast here. Tsimshan Territory is where my name is from. I'm currently living in Gitxsan Territory, where I own and operate an initiative called Tea Creek. Tea Creek is what I'm going to be talking about today, but more broadly, I'm going to be talking about the opportunity that exists for this country and globally to meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples and open doors for us to fully participate in the economy and all the benefits that can bring. So first thing I want to talk about is how Tea Creek got started. It's award-winning initiative. We won the BC Land Award last year for Best Use of Food Lands. We were selected by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization as North America's food hero last October for World Food Day. I was invited to speak at Indigenous Caucus event, COP 15 in Montreal, and was the opening speaker there. And then more recently, I was an expert witness to the Senate Standing Committee on Agriculture and Food. Yeah, and this is all within the last 3 years. So we launched Tea Creek in 2021, and kind of begs the question, like, why are we getting all this attention? What's going on? So my family and I, we started a farm. I was a business consultant prior to that. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. I was winner of a Young Entrepreneur of the Year award from the BC Achievement Foundation back when I was still a young entrepreneur. Don't ask me how old I am. I'm not young. I'm a young entrepreneur anymore. No, I'm now a middle-aged entrepreneur. I saw what was coming, and we wanted to get back to the land, and we wanted to have our own resiliency as a family. And we saw that homesteading and doing what our ancestors did, which is being abundant in food, being food sovereign was a key to that resiliency. So we bought an old farm, sold everything, bought a farm, moved out here. And we're immediately overwhelmed with all the love that came from our Indigenous families and communities for what we were doing. So what I didn't realize at the time when I got started is that Indigenous peoples were largely agrarian, maybe not in the way that mainstream people think of it, but we were stewards of the land, and our ancestors produced a huge abundance of food, which is well documented. Jason mentions the Spanish and the British, those early contacts here on the West Coast. I've looked at some of those journals and letters, and one thing that stood out to me is how shocked Europeans were with how much food Indigenous people produced here on the West Coast and this part of the world. They commented on the incredible quality of the housing, which they described as being equal or better quality to anything back home in Europe. The clothing, which was opulent by their standards at the time, and they commented on the food, which was equally opulent compared to the standards. And in fact, first settlers in BC, they did a competition between European farming methods, and I've got it documented here in a book, and the Indigenous farming methods at the time, and they found that the Indigenous methods were more than double as productive as the European methods. So as the colony of British Columbia grew and the conflicts over land started, what did the colonial government do? They actually banned and outlawed those Indigenous technologies and tools that were so competitive and did really well. So specific things were banned, and those technologies that existed are making a comeback today, because today our food systems are in trouble globally. Soils are depleting incredibly quickly. Indigenous people were building soil instead of depleting it in their food production. The tools and technology that were used were regenerative, so they were contributing to biodiversity and ecosystem regeneration instead of depleting it. And so now there's a huge rush on Indigenous intellectual property. So I'll mention that. So what happened is we got flooded with Indigenous people wanting to come to our farm because Indigenous people were banned from farming in Canada. And in fact, the pass and permit system, which was designed to completely destroy the Indigenous food economy and economy in general, wasn't repealed until 2014. And the legacies of those laws, federal laws, still exist within Canadian institutions. And my experience is a lot of institutions don't even know why they say no, right? They don't realize like the vestiges of this oppressive genocidal policy still exist in ridiculous ways within banks, for example, within tractor dealerships. When you go and try and buy a tractor and they're like, don't we need a letter of permission from your in order to sell you a tractor? So so there's a lot of things that still linger within our economy if you're Indigenous that stop us from participating in the economy, and in my case, in the food economy. So I'm giving you the little history lesson, and I went on a little long there, but I want to talk, I just want to bring forward this history, because one of the pushbacks we receive is, weren't your people hunter-gatherers? Why are you a farmer? And I'm like, no, our people actually weren't, we cultivated ecosystems to produce an abundance of food. That's what we were doing. And some people call that farming, and some people call it other things, but that's what we did. So my ancestors were aquaculturists, and here in Gitxsan territory, they were incredibly successful farmers and ranchers, up until that was actively removed from Gitxsan people here. So so that's a little bit of the background. Move to the next slide here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our model. So we have what's called the Tea Creek model. Jason mentioned Indigenous-led. We're Indigenous-led. And the way we define Indigenous-led, we've adopted from another Indigenous organization, which is that a majority of decisions made at every level of our organization every day are made by Indigenous people. And this is a really, really important concept, because what we've found is when you put the decision-making in the hands of Indigenous people, the benefits of those decisions are going to be flow out of an Indigenous framework, mindset, and view, which is about what we would say in the mainstream as an environmental priority, social priority, economic priority, local job creation, and local governance and local decision making. So our impact is off the charts. So in 2021, our first year of operation, we engaged more Indigenous people in trades than all other post-secondary programs in British Columbia combined. In our region last year, Indigenous participation in post-secondary trades has doubled. It's gone from 10% to 20%. And we've been told that we're a big part of that doubling of participation. So why is this working? It's working because we're Indigenous led, and we've reinvented post-secondary skills training and trades training from an Indigenous, 100% Indigenous lens. So we're focused on the same competency development, and it's working 1,000 times better because we're doing it in a land-based, Indigenous-led, culturally safe way. And it's incredibly attractive to Indigenous people to come here and do this and get active in the economy. So currently today, we have triple the participation on our site so far this spring than we did last year. And we can barely keep up. It's really crazy. And actually, I'm looking out my window right now and talking about governance. The local hereditary chiefs asked to come and meet here at our farm, and I'm looking out at a big long table of hereditary chiefs meeting here on our site to talk about governance and to talk about economic development and how we can transform our regional economy together, which is super, super exciting. So yeah, urgencies. This is why we're here. I mean, we've got, as Scott mentioned, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, over 80%, is on land managed by Indigenous peoples. Those lands represent about 20% of the world's land, and Indigenous people are doing all of this on less than 1% of the world's financial resources. Another really important statistic I learned while in Montreal is that Indigenous peoples globally are contributing over 30% of the planet's climate goals on less than 1% of the world's financial resources. So we are shouldering the burden for the world right now when it comes to saving our planet. And yet we have almost no money. And access to money is by far our biggest barrier here at Tea Creek. And it's by far, when we talk to First Nations who are wanting to get into this and do what we're doing and produce food and create jobs, and localize these economic systems and food systems, money is non-existent. So there's a problem here. You know, there's a great injustice that's currently underway, that's still happening, that needs some serious correcting. And when we correct it, we all win. That's something I really want to underline, is that Indigenous people are not holding these benefits for themselves. They're holding the benefits for everybody, for your local community. You know, the Tahltan are the biggest employer, period, to everybody up here in the north. They don't just employ Indigenous people, they employ everybody, and they're making sure those jobs are local. They're not importing people from other places that would typically be done. They have a human resources policy that basically says, before you import any workers, you're hiring local 100% of the time. And that's an Indigenous viewpoint, an Indigenous value, and everybody benefits. So I already talked about this, some Indigenous alignment. My essential argument here is that the money to do what we're doing exists already. There's already, the market exists. It's just getting wasted. I have an example, a very simple example, and that is, if you fly, there's a box you can check to offset your carbon footprint. And some people check it and you pay, and that money goes into a market to offset to do something to offset your carbon footprint. So typically it's let's plant some trees, right? Well, an investigation was done in the United States and found that that's mostly wasted money. Like it's not doing what they're promising. You know, it's going to this market, and then the marketplace is going, what do we do with this? Okay, let's hand it out to these nonprofits, perhaps, or these charities that have nice flashy websites saying they're going to plant trees, and they're not. So the money's there. If that money was, for example, to start going to Indigenous-led initiatives, I guarantee you it's going to generate incredible results because the data is already there. We already see that. The data has been studied, it's been established, it's been accepted globally by the United Nations. That's why returning lands to Indigenous peoples is one of the pillars of fighting climate change, because it's been proven. It's been proven here in Canada as well. So there are markets. There's post-secondary education money, which is why we are able to operate, is that that money already exists and it's going into initiatives. This Indigenous money, education money, is going into initiatives that are absolutely failing Indigenous people and are incredibly expensive. So all we're doing is giving that money a new home to do off the charts results, right? So the same kind of thing through the Indigenous-led models, whether it's a formal Indigenous governance structure, such as Jason talked about, or an informal one, such as the one that we've created, like a more private market reality, which is where we are. The money's there, the opportunity's there, it's already been proven, and we just need to start connecting the dots, which is really easy, like policy shifts, dot connecting to actually start moving these resources where they should be going, which is to Indigenous-led initiatives that are generating results like I talked about here at Tea Creek. So food sovereignty, what is food sovereignty? Well, it's about food production, it's about food education, it's about the right to make your own policy decisions locally around food. And Indigenous food sovereignty is so important because we had our food sovereignty completely attacked and in a lot of places totally destroyed as a tactic to undermine Indigenous governance and undermine Indigenous sovereignty and land sovereignty. It was to remove food sovereignty as one of the top things on our pillar of needs. So Indigenous food sovereignty is a wonderful vehicle for healing, for local food security. We produce over 10,000 pounds an acre here at Tea Creek. We donate it out into the community. We feed roughly 200 to 400 families every year. We serve currently over 2,000 free meals on our site every day to Indigenous peoples. And it creates a lot of jobs. Canada is currently facing a shortage within 10 years of 40,000 people within the agriculture and food economy. Here at Tea Creek, we introduced over 1,400 Indigenous people to agriculture and food on our site alone last year. About 1/3 of those people want to participate in the food and agriculture economy as their career, as their business, and we're just one little speck of what's now British Columbia. Imagine if the Tea Creek model could be deployed 30 times over in British Columbia, 200 times over in Canada. Indigenous people could easily fill the void within the agriculture and food economy. So I'm just going to wrap it up because I'm just looking at the time. I want to leave some room for questions. We're growing at a bit of an insane rate right now here at Tea Creek, and it's all grassroots driven. So we haven't even printed any posters or handed anything out, and we have almost 200 registered students here, Indigenous students who want to dedicate themselves to getting a ticket in a trade, start their own business. And that's within 6 weeks of opening our doors for 2023. So we've exceeded our annual target already in a month and a half for dedicated Indigenous trainees. So our model works. It's amazing, and we'd like to see a lot more Indigenous peoples taking the lead and taking the lead at every level. So let's start with board of directors that Scott talked about. Like, it's insane how underrepresented we are in Canada within leadership levels, management levels. Our CEOs. Why can't we be Indigenous, all the way to our worker levels? So. Yeah, I mentioned, so we did a survey of First Nations who are actively working in the food economy or trying to get into the food economy, and barriers are significant. So the barriers, roughly in order, are lack of access to land or ability to purchase or acquire land. Pretty much tied with that is access to financing. Money resources are incredibly difficult. So I talked to a funder that did a study on this here in British Columbia, and they found that First Nations or Indigenous peoples are required to do 25 times as much paperwork for the same dollar as non-Indigenous peoples. So the barriers are really, really significant. Like, that would be a terrible statistic if it was 2 times, and instead it's 25 times is what their study found. Yeah, so I think I'm just going to wrap it up for now. I think I've said enough, and I really look forward to some Q&A and discussions. So thank you for listening and making the space for me today. Wow, that's some impressive work, Jacob, that you're doing on your farm. It's really, I can hear the passion in your voice and in the words that you bring. And Jason, the same thing about the nation that you work for, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, seeing the, as I described it, quiet but really powerful leadership. I don't see your nation bragging, and I think you should brag a little bit. And I hope this was maybe an opportunity a little bit, but I don't see the nation getting enough credit for the leadership that I think is being done and the results that are coming about as a consequence of the land use plan that you walked us through. And just as a quick aside before we go to questions, when we see biodiversity return, especially in regions adjacent to a major metropolitan area like the Greater Vancouver region, when we see orca whales return to the harbor inlets and the foreshore areas and into Indian Arm, like, everyone benefits from that. Like the whole regional economy, the whole people just in general, I think benefit from seeing and knowing that nature is thriving. So, some of those benefits aren't tangible and they're hard to measure, but they are real. So thank you for sharing those real life examples, both of you, Jason and Jacob, for how First Nations in particular are advancing sustainability and ESG in very meaningful and substantive ways. So just in wrapping up, I think, like I mentioned, as nations like Tsleil-Waututh, who are the people of the inlet, regain control of their territory and restore the foreshore marine habitat that brings back the herring and the salmon that the orca whales feed on. This adds to the quality of life, as I mentioned, to everyone. When First Nations people reclaim their traditional practices, we see immediate improvement in the social and economic well-being of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in all communities. First Nations-led projects like the Tea Creek Farm, as Jacob showed us, it can help solve our food security problems all across Canada. We will all benefit from this type of Indigenous leadership. There's no shortage of such examples of First Nations leading the way. A commitment to sustainability and 7th-generation thinking results in incredible success stories that meets the needs of today's world. When Indigenous factors are embedded into ESG standards, we'll see more sustainability in development projects across sectors. We'll see enhanced access to capital for sustainable projects. And we'll see increased collaboration with First Nation communities and Indigenous peoples, which benefits all Canadians. So thank you. This now concludes our session. I now look forward to responding to some of the questions that I see coming through through the app. So Yvonne, I think you're going to step up now. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Terrific presentation, gentlemen. Great storytelling, exposing my ignorance, I'll speak for myself, and at least piquing the curiosity of at least one viewer, I want to go back to Jacob about the story with the tractor and the letter. Could you wrap that up for me, please?
Yeah, I can wrap it up for you really quickly. So in 1888, from lobbying from the province of British Columbia and a collection of farmers, the federal government passed a set of laws to destroy the Indigenous agriculture economy, which was over competing. It was too successful. And so they passed 3 laws, and those, one of them stayed in place until 2014. So one was called the Severance Policy, which forbid Indigenous people from owning generally more than 20 acres of land on or off reserve. So those families that owned thousands of acres of farm and ranch land had it removed, and they were allowed to keep 20 to 60 acres, varied from province to province or area to area. That was the Severance Policy. And then the Peasant Policy forbid Indigenous people from using any modern tools or technology, which included tractors. So it was illegal to purchase anything that was considered modern or to own it. If they had it, it was removed. And then the third one was called the Pass and Permit, which was in place in 2014. And Pass and Permit, you couldn't purchase supplies or materials for agriculture without permission from an Indian agent, which they were instructed not to ever give. And then you weren't allowed to sell food product to anybody, including people off reserve. And that policy was initially restricted to field crops in 1951. So Indigenous peoples figured it out and transitioned to aquaculture and ranching. So there became some very successful Indigenous ranches. In 1951, it was cast to close those loopholes, and Indigenous people couldn't ranch or fish or have any food product. And then that was in place until 2014. So I talked to a tractor dealer owner, educating and working on support. So here where we are, we were one of the only First Nations people in 2021 that had a tractor.
In 2021?
2021. So we got inundated with requests to bring our tractor into we have 6 local First Nations communities, because people needed their yards tilled and there wasn't a single tractor. So I was the first Indigenous person in this valley to have a tractor in 2021. And it was hugely exciting. So one of the most popular experiences people have, from children to adults, is they get to come to our farm, and we purchase as many tractors as we can afford, and we do tractor training, and people get to sit on a tractor. And if you look on our Instagram, you can see a lot of smiling Indigenous faces on a tractor. People have literally, like, we've had a 69-year-old elder whose dream her whole life was to be on a machine because she's never been allowed. And she came here in 2020 and had her first ever experience sitting on a backhoe. And it made her year. And so that's a little bit of the history. Yeah.
What a proud history we have. All right, let's get to some questions, if we may here. Is there a way, and I've heard Scott Munro talk about this, there is a way for non-Indigenous people to invest in Indigenous businesses. Yes, Scott?
Yes. Is the question is there a way to invest in Indigenous businesses? Yeah. Yeah, there is. I mean, as Jacob really highlighted, there's the biggest barrier is access to capital. For First Nations who have or want to start businesses, they do rely on other outside capital providers. So I think there is great opportunity to partner and invest. I think it's all about how you go about that, looking for that opportunity. You know, I think it's about building that relationship up front and understanding what the values of the Indigenous business owner or person might be, or the nation might be, and having some honest conversations at the very beginning, because ultimately it'll be about trust, and that trust is what's going to be the foundation of any business relationship with a First Nation or Indigenous peoples.
Can I just pick up a phone or send an email and say, okay, I've got capital to invest? Is there a clearinghouse of some sort?
No, That's a great question, actually. Not as such, but there are a growing number of First Nations-led and Indigenous-led business councils and business organizations. There's the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, for example. So that might be an opportunity. You might become a member of that association, for example, and begin your journey of networking and meeting Indigenous business people and entrepreneurs. I think it's just about getting out and meeting and getting to know the nations that you want to work with and getting to know their people.
Okay. Would you have recommendations for how we can increase the pool of Indigenous candidates for board positions? Known candidates are in great demand, of course.
Yeah, this is becoming, I mean, it's one of those things, be careful what you ask for, right?
Okay.
I start to see now businesses really starting to realize that they do need and how underrepresented Indigenous people are on board. So I think, again, speaking with organizations like the RRII, which is the Responsible Reconciliation Investment Initiative, which is a partnership with SHARE, which is a Canadian shareholder advocacy organization. That might be one place that you could go. And again, I think the CCAB that I mentioned earlier would be another place you could begin to inquire and look for candidates. But the reality is, there's the talent pool is relatively small. I mean, I guess starting with the fact that we only make up a small part of Canada's population, but we are growing fast. And so the thing I'll end with is I would suggest be very open to recognizing the amazing experience and governance experience and skill that many Indigenous people have that won't be reflected by the traditional credentials that you might otherwise be looking for at the end of people's names. And for some of the reasons that Jacob alluded to, you could have similar comments on the barriers to access to education and especially post-secondary education. So I think companies need to be very aware of that barrier and not be necessarily limiting their search.
Okay. I'll finish with Jacob here. How can we reach Tea Creek, first of all? And has your model been replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, so you can reach Tea Creek on our website, teacreek.ca. And you can email me, Jacob, at teacreek.ca. We're working on raising funds to be able to replicate our model. Protection of our intellectual property is really important, and I'm an advocate for protection of Indigenous intellectual property just because so much has been stolen. And even today, people like organizations have attempted to sort of plunder Tea Creek for their own profit, and so we don't want that. We want proper, relationships that anyone would expect in this sort of situation. The question about the markets is a really fantastic one, and that's one that First Nations Financial Management Board and we've been having a lot of conversations about this, like that we do need a market, effective market setup that facilitates investment into Indigenous businesses nationwide. And currently, it doesn't really exist, So it's definitely on the to-do list, high on the to-do list right now. Yeah.
I hope so, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much. Have a good summer. Break time now. Back at the top of the hour with two concurrent sessions: unmeasured and uncontrolled carbon price risk in corporations, and pathways to board work for women, understanding experiences and barriers. Back soon.